A lot of people came into the field early on in the sort of 1960s and 1970s with a wide variety of backgrounds and disciplines and intellectual interests. What was yours, and did you actually get involved in this field?
I started off as a biologist. I did my first degree down at Imperial College and then stayed on and did a doctorate in plant pathology and then lectured there for 3 years. It was an overseas development ministry appointment, a marvellous appointment, where they could send me anywhere in the world for 75% of the time. And I actually spent 2 of the 3 years in Uganda working on a regional crop improvement programme. But I've been very involved in development activism when I was a student with my girlfriend at the time. We later got married. And I was already very interested in north-south issues, broad global issues, even though professionally I was on the science side. And while I was in Uganda, I got even more interested in development studies, and particularly conflict over resources. I moved back to Britain and we took a bit of a risk. I took a job at one of the new polytechnics where they were trying to develop a degree course in human ecology, bringing together political science, economics and the biological sciences.
So aside from the opportunity, what attracted you to come into this field?
I suppose it's because I'd really been interested in global issues right from when I was in my teens. And I'd actually seen working in the plant pathology area contributing to agricultural development is a really good way of doing it. And I'm still committed to that in a sense. I still do some lecturing on food policy. But I got very interested in the environmental issues in the 70s when it was becoming a major theme. And I got personally really interested in conflict over resources at the time with the first oil price hike in 73, 74, and started writing on that at that time. But I was very lucky to be in the kind of environment where you could develop down an interdisciplinary tack coming from the pure sciences really into the social sciences.
As you say, it probably wouldn't happen today.
No, and teaching myself as I went along, which certainly wouldn't be allowed now.
All right. Okay, tell me a bit more though about how did you get here? How did you get to Bradford?
Well, essentially, over that time, 8 years I spent down at Huddersfield, I was with a couple of colleagues. We worked very closely together. Towards the end of the 70s, partly through bureaucracy, partly through the lack of any opportunity to do graduate work or research supervision, we tended to get rather itchy feet. And I think all 3 of us left and moved elsewhere. And I was looking for the possibility of further developments, and I knew about the Peace Studies Centre and had followed its development over the first 3 or 4 years. And then suddenly a job came up here, a senior lectureship. I was lucky in a way in that I wasn't quite in peace research then, but the course here was run as what was called a sandwich course, with students spending a year out in their 4 years. And I'd run the sandwich component at Huddersfield, so I was one of the very few people around who'd run that kind of course in a related area. I think it's the real reason why they took me on, even though I was a biologist.
When you got here to Bradford, you were coming into a department of peace studies rather than conflict analysis.
Yes, I was, and I suppose even from the start I was coming to it from what you might call the hard end of peace research. I was interested in big issues of international conflict. Malcolm and I really took the view very soon after we came here that we needed to work on East-West arms control issues. There were so few independent places, and this is when the anti-nuclear campaigning of the 1980s was just starting to get going. So we actually both moved our research fields quite deliberately to look at nuclear and related issues, and Malcolm's interest in bioweapons came very much from that time. So yes, we were at that sort of hard end, I suppose, of peace research. But because I've been involved in activism, I was very sympathetic to the idea that, scholarship is our activism, as James O'Connor would put it. But there were very big tensions in the department at that time, very big differences of opinion about the kind of department it should be. It took 2 or 3 years for those to settle down, and particularly for the department to pursue a very strong academic line, but at the same time, I think, maintaining real critical independence.
So, but not just in the department. I mean, there were very strong tensions within the field.
There were very strong tensions, yes.
I don't know whether you were at that famous confrontation between Walter Izard and some of the American peace researchers and the Scandinavians who attacked them very much over Vietnam.
I wasn't involved in that, and I wasn't too aware of that conflict at the time. I suppose coming into Bradford, where the department, I was appointed in '79, Bradford University was hit tremendously by very big financial cuts in '81, imposed by government on the more technology universities, quite incredibly. And we actually had a very hard job to ensure the survival of the department. So in a sense, we were really quite inward-looking and trying to concentrate on developing this centre, and were far less aware of the very big debates and controversies in peace research as a whole. But we survived that period, and essentially, although the university lost several departments, it became rather leaner. I think we lost some very good people, though, but at least we survived.
Yes, they were quite desperate times, because of course that was only the first of a series of cuts.
That's right, yeah.
All right, going back to your coming to Bradford, and you and Malcolm starting to work on arms control, disarmament, alternative defence, etc., and coming from your end of the intellectual spectrum, the field's always sort of had this objective of being considered one of the social sciences, and being scientific, and eventually becoming one of the social science disciplines. Do you think that this was something which Bradford sort of deliberately tried to do, or tried to avoid, or tried to mix the two ends of the spectrum from humanities approaches to?
I'm not sure there was anything conscious about it. Essentially, we did mix them. We had some very tough times, particularly in the 83-84 period, when the government targeted this department and wanted it closed down, but couldn't directly do it because the University Grants Committee did have a degree of independence. I think partly the government saw us as a department of appeasement studies, because the reality was we were providing research and backup which was used a lot by the anti-nuclear movement. We were pretty scrupulous. We were always doing studies of Soviet as well as American nukes and the rest. But the very fact that we were publishing this stuff was very annoying to government. The curious thing is that we had quite a good relationship with civil servants in the Ministry of Defence. I started lecturing at Defence Staff Colleges in '82, and have done it ever since. And they've always had us back. Malcolm's done much of the same. I think one of the things which really incurred the enmity of government was the fact that we tended to be independent analysts at the time of the Falklands and Malvinas War. And that was not the done thing. I mean, if you were expressing any type of independent analysis, there's a little bit of graffiti I remember around the campus which just said they used to hang traitors, now they give them degrees in peace studies. So you did get this feeling, and so, but that had quite a unifying effect in the department. Although I think we were already working together pretty much as a team, whether we were historians, economists, social scientists, or coming from the natural scientists. And the key thing was that the effect of this sort of attack on the department had two really very good things. It made us better academics, because everything you did, everything you published was subject to scrutiny. Right. You had to be high standard. The second thing was we attracted some extremely good research students. Students coming to do research, people like Malcolm Chalmers, who's now one of the senior professors here 25 years later. So in a curious way, that period of intense opposition from government was partly the making of the department.
Oh, how interesting, because I had a somewhat similar experience in the period 84-85 when we were setting up some dialogues between British parliamentarians and Argentinian parliamentarians. Right. And when we started out, almost nobody was willing to take the risk of going and talking to the Argentinians. This was about a year after the war was finished. Eventually, several people climbed on board, and talking to them was okay. But in those days, you talked to the Argentinians.
A traitor.
Yes. Could probably talk to them about football, but that was about it. So. Anyway, you must have made quite a switch from coming here interested in development, and then you and Malcolm deciding to focus on the arms control alternative defence line. Can you think of anybody who very much influenced your thinking around about this time? I mean, it must have been...
Well, certainly people like E.P. Thompson were significant. Also, some of the people of an earlier generation of physicists, like P.M.S. Blackett. I mean, Blackett had been professor of physics at Imperial when I was a young undergraduate there, and I saw him around the campus 2 or 3 times. And he was a real figurehead because he'd moved away, very, very much opposed to nuclear weapons. And there were a number of other people like him. So yes, you had this very strong scientific thread of opposition to nuclear weapons, and I came from a science background as well. So in other words, there was an affinity there. In terms of wider influence on global issues, I would certainly cite Barbara Ward as the key influence. I come from a Roman Catholic background. I was involved in the Catholic Justice and Peace movement at that time in the 60s and 70s, and she was an iconic figure. I met her once or twice and quite proud that I did, and certainly she was somebody who I thought was really worth following and learning from. And she also had this somewhat interdisciplinary tack. She wasn't working on, in any sense, on East-West issues, but her global vision I thought was very powerful.
All right, you mentioned a little earlier the sort of multidisciplinary nature of peace research and conflict research. We seem to be constantly borrowing from other people and other disciplines. Were there any sort of major ideas as you got more embedded into the peace research field that you picked up on and ran with and thought were useful?
In a sense, yes. I mean, I suppose I was picking up particularly on developments in political economy. Before I came to Bradford, I had actually worked fairly intensively on the interplay between environmental constraints and development. I edited a couple of books on that. One was on future resources and world development, which was really trying to look at the risk of international conflict over resources, particularly oil. And in a sense, I was borrowing from development studies, which I'd read up on fairly well, and looking at global security with a much stronger interest in the resource base and the potential for control of major areas. We did some work here in the
20 years too soon.
20 years too soon, and the curious thing is I go back to that book which was published I think almost 30 years ago. I'm actually quite proud that we were at least trying to work in that field at that time. And in a sense, that's one of the things that brought me to peace studies. And in a way, the 10 years of the 1980s were a diversion from what I was interested in the long term. They were diversion quite distinct and definite into issues of arms control and disarmament. I remember James O'Connell once said that in a sense you had to work on this because in the tensions of the second stage of the Cold War, I think he used an Irish phrase, it's the bond closest to your throat that you first cut loose. The most immediate problem was the nuclear issue. And we basically diverted 10 years of our career to that. And since then, since the early 90s, Malcolm has gone through to biological weapons, which uniquely combines his international security work with his biological training. I've gone back to working on the interplay between socioeconomic divisions and environmental constraints, and really that's been in the last 15 years.
Yeah, I remember, I think the last thing of yours that I read was that nice book that you wrote where you start off talking about this all-white development.
The Heritage Park, yes, losing control.
That's
yes.
right, yeah.
Yes, that's the two things I'm proud of are writing that book and actually building a barn back home on the small holding. There's something physical there, you see.
Yeah.
But losing control really took me back to something I'd been interested in for 30 years. Yeah. And it's certainly true that I think, like with Malcolm, having a science background was really very helpful. I'd done chemistry to pass degree level. I wasn't that good on the physics side, but at least when you're dealing with weapon systems, put it this way, if you're talking to military audiences, then they would give you rather more respect since you had some technical competence, and that was a help.
Yeah. Now, again, going back to my own sort of experience around that time, I remember the very fashionable thing to have read, particularly if you were in a system science department like I was the Meadows work.
That's right, yes.
Growth, and everybody was, in my place anyway, was frantically developing dynamical models and things like that, where Meadows had gone wrong, sort of thing, and it wasn't as bad as he said it was, but I think probably it is going to be as bad as
yes, I mean, again, he was pretty early. The key thing that I was really interested in was the combination of the limits to growth idea with the north-south divisions. Because essentially, if the southern countries were mainly the locus of the world's resources, most of the world's physical resources that had been housed in the industrialized world had long been used up. You know, I mean, Britain had the world's largest copper mine 150 years ago. It's been derelict for 100 years. And essentially, if you have the resources coming from the south, then this appears to give them actually a latent power when all the trade systems are against them.
Only get themselves organised.
Well, this is why OPEC was so significant, and a lot of the work I did in the mid-70s was on producer power and whether other producers would follow. So to go back to your original point, yes, I suppose borrowing to some extent from political economy, but I was learning the whole time.
The whole field of peace research, conflict research, whatever we're going to call it, seems to have become much more complex over the years. I mean, the whole business about sort of peacekeeping, peacemaking, peace building, etc., and conflict resolution, conflict management, conflict termination, etc. There's a huge sort of diversity in the field. How's that affected the work here? I mean, I'm terribly impressed simply walking around here with the number of people you've got here and the number of students. But
well, as the department has grown, I mean, we had about 8 to 10 staff for the first 10 years or so, including research fellows. We're now well over 30. We've got 120 odd master students from 40 countries. We've got 60 doctoral students. So because of this wealth of people, while the field has grown more complex and more diversified, we still cover most of the areas because we have people from so many different disciplines who've come in. And I think this is one of the reasons why the department is very healthy at the present time. We're not too big to have become sort of disjointed and fragmented. And I think the other thing is that most of the staff who were with the department in the very early days, Tom Woodhouse, Malcolm Dando, Sarah Perigo and others, are still here. And basically their careers have been focused on this department. And we know how easy it is for a peace centre to come apart through disagreements. And so we actually work very hard at maintaining a resilience and a coherence among the staff. And I think that's one of the key things that's held the department together. We're very lucky we've got some immensely talented younger people coming in as well.
Well, if you'll forgive me, I'm giving you a word of advice. What you want to do is resist like mad this move to take you back to the main building and put you on 2 floors.
Yeah.
Because that's just happened to
us.
Yes. I'm on the 6th floor. I never see anybody from the 5th floor.
Yeah.
I mean, it really is physically very dividing.
Yeah, we'll certainly do our best to avoid that.
Good. All right. Have there been any sort of major themes that have held the place together? Because, as you say, there are other examples of centres that have galloped off in all directions and sort of fallen apart.
I think once it held together through the difficult period through until about 1985, the resilience by then was inbuilt. And of course, by 1990, the idea of peace studies being something way out in the margins was really starting to disappear. I did a certain amount of journalism and a fair bit of radio and telly work in the 1980s. I used to describe myself as a defence analyst at Bradford University because I was more likely to get printed or on air than calling myself from a Department of Peace Studies. The crucial thing is, from the very early 90s, that was no longer necessary. Because with the post-Cold War world, with the work that Tom and others were doing on conflict resolution and peacekeeping, people suddenly realized that peace was actually a positive issue. And for the last 15 years, we've never used what's basically a device to get on air, calling ourselves defence analysts. And people know the department as being, if I can use it, a sound department. I don't think we've changed in terms of being critical. I think in any way we've become more acceptable because of the way the world's moved.
Well, that's interesting because I've missed all that. Of course, I've been over in the States, but I remember, probably in the early 1980s at my place, I tried to get a course on conflict analysis and resolution going. And the only way I could get it through the Board of Studies was to call it conflict management.
Yes.
Management they understood.
Yes.
But anything else, and I wouldn't have dared use the word peace.
Yes.
God, no.
Well, we were under pressure a number of times in the 80s to change it to a Department of Peace and Conflict Studies. But we resisted, and mainly because, after all, this department was a Quaker initiative originally. It was the Society of Friends who wanted the university to do it. We knew the Quakers would have been horrified if we had this name change. And also, I think many of the staff were just cussed. We didn't see why we had to change because outside people wanted us to. And we're delighted that we never did, that it remained a Department of Peace Studies. So, yes, in that sense, I think it's we came through, and we had a very strong degree of unity, which has been maintained.
No, that's certainly the impression you get from outside. Anyway. Okay. All right. Well, going back a little bit to the early days, it's nice to think about the 90s with some successes there. Who do you think, from your point of view, were some of the sort of seminal figures in the development of the field of peace studies? I mean, Adam, obviously, but who else?
Adam, obviously. I mean, Elise and Kenneth Boulding, certainly very significant. Going back to people like Rappaport, and I mean, going back, although it was, in a sense, it was his work after his death, Lewis Fry Richardson. Obviously, some of the European peace researchers, Bert Rolling, people like that, I think, were very significant. But in a sense, we were almost trying to develop a department which used all that thinking, but also systematically brought in other disciplines at the same time. So quite a lot of the teaching that was going on here was not conventional political science or development studies, but pretty close to it, and applying those disciplinary areas to the peace or the conflict problematic.
Yeah. Well, I think they did something similar at George Mason.
Yes.
When it was the Centre for Conflict Analysis when it started back in the 80s, and I think it started off with a director, a deputy director, one lecturer, and then everything else was taught by bringing people from other disciplines and other...
Well, our difference here was that almost from the start, most of the teaching was done by our own staff, and the staff were actually, it was an integrated department of people of very different disciplines. And basically people tended to forget what discipline they came from, and work together in a pretty cooperative way. Other staff from other departments were sympathetic and taught in the department. One of our great allies actually is the current university librarian, John Horton, who was involved really from the start, right at the start of the department. John is also a very well recognized expert on Yugoslavia, on the Balkans, but he's long been a very consistent and hugely welcome supporter of the department. We tend to forget about the role that he's played, but it's been significant. And having the Commonweal collection, this private collection of incredible collection of peace books in the university library has been a huge asset from the start.
Yeah, well, you were lucky with that.
Yes, we were. That was a sort of a 12,000 book collection. Sure. Well, certainly on the question of other Europeans, Johan Galtung, obviously. In my sort of area, on the arms control and disarmament side, I would actually point to the work of CIPRI. Because I think CIPRI actually was very significant in the 1980s as being an international centre for work on arms and disarmament, and under successive directors I think it was actually quite had an important role. If anything, it was a role which tended to complement or perhaps even counter the strategic studies centres, presenting rather different views.
Yeah, that was Frank Barnaby.
Frank, yes, who I still work with now. I mean, he's long since retired, but he's a security consultant to a very interesting little non-government organisation, the Oxford Research Group. I work for them as well on about a fifth of my time. So he is still active, and people both before and after him as well. Frank Blackerby was after him, and Frank was very much involved in the Alternative Defence Commission in Britain. On the business of disciplines, if you look at the department of that time, we're talking about, the late 1980s. Obviously there would have been Malcolm and myself, James O'Connell, who would have been a mixture of sort of philosophy and government, Tom Woodhouse, essentially a social historian, Sarah Perigo, really primarily a political scientist, Tom Gallagher as well, Peter van den Dungen, economist by original training, moving into international relations.
I didn't realise Peter was an economist.
Originally, yes. Malcolm Chalmers, who joined us a little bit later, a development economist who had done his PhD here. Sean Gregory, who joined the department as a lecturer rather later on, but had been a research fellow. Now the head of department is actually also a biologist by original training. And then Owen Green joining us from a physics background. So a mixture of the social sciences and sciences, and then later on in the 90s, Donna Pankhurst from anthropology, Jenny Pierce from political science, and many others from across the social sciences.
Certainly an interesting mix. I think our sort of particular outfit at George Mason University, I don't think we can actually boast the same inclusion of hard sciences. I mean, I think the hardest we get are people like Dan Druckmann, who's really a sort of a quantitative psychologist, but Yeah, we have lawyers and political scientists
Right.
and international relations specialists, but you certainly seem to have gone broader than
We're
that.
actually a bit weak on international law, but I mean, Oliver Ransbottom, who was head of department immediately after me, was basically a philosophy graduate who'd also done a maths degree. So again, an eclectic group, I would have to say.
Yes, indeed. Okay, so you painted this picture of the department as being, and I don't mean this in any negative sense, rather inward-looking in the early years,
Yes.
you know, from a purely defensive
Yeah.
point of view. But you must have started to break out of that at some particular point and join the field. You obviously pioneered it in the 80s with the arms control work and the stuff. But how did you, as a department, become aware of and linked into other places and other institutions and other people? I mean, did that occur gradually, or?
I think it occurred gradually. I point to two developments towards the end of the 80s, early 90s. One, without question, was Tom Woodhouse and his colleagues establishing the Centre for Conflict Resolution. You know, ahead of its time as far as most European centres were concerned. This was the, late 80s. And that sort of broadens out a lot and brought us into the whole conflict resolution field in a rather more formal way. The other thing was that we actually began to be under rather less pressure internally, so we literally had more time to be active in travelling, to be active in going to International Peace Research Association congresses, which we hadn't really done before. And the department was very much concerned with building itself up, getting more students in, students coming from all over the place. So by the end of the 80s, the department had branched out a great deal. We also got a curious and unexpected boost in terms of our status in Britain by the 1991 Gulf War. Rather like the 1982 Falklands-Malvinas War, staff here several of us were very active in doing analysis and doing media work. Now, the problem for us was that we tended to take a very critical view of the very heavy use of military force and did analyses which suggested it wasn't going quite as expected. Now, that war ended apparently very quickly. And so some of us who'd been saying this could go on for a long time were immediately castigated in the national media.
Yeah.
But within 2 or 3 months, with the disasters in the Kurdish area, with the Shiites, when the conventional media was saying, Saddam was saying, won't last 6 weeks. And when by the middle of 1991 it was proving to be a very different situation, again there tended to be a kind of memory that weird crowd at Bradford, maybe there was something in what they were saying. And I think we got a certain amount of respect, in a sense, for being rather independent. Now, that is not the same as our sort of breaking out, but it gave the department a boost, and it brought in a lot more students who were interested in what we were doing.
Well, certainly just looking around at the students who are here at the moment, you've got a very diverse lot, haven't you?
Quite incredible. I mean, we do get some ex-military, we get some who want to go into the military, we get well-known peace activists. I mean, probably the two leading peace activists in Britain at present would be Lindis Percy, who's involved with this campaign for the accountability of American bases, who's in her late 50s, and Angie Zelter, who has been involved with Trident Ploughshares. Both of them are former students from the department. And we still keep links. Some of us, myself in particular, regularly have to give character witnesses for former students in court cases where they've been invading bases. And most interestingly, we're often involved when the activists are trying to get the issue of the ethics of nuclear use into open court. So you end up as an expert witness trying to explain in open court what British nuclear targeting policy is now, the fact we still have a first use policy. And that can be quite tough, but it's certainly an interesting work for an academic.
Well, I mean, there's always in the field as a whole been this tension, I guess it's a tension between, academia, academic respectability, traditional research, and on the other hand, practice, involvement, activism, etc., etc. I'm not sure the field has balanced it very well, but you certainly seem to have confronted that and dealt with it rather effectively.
Yeah, I think what we did, I mean, I was actually on the National Council of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament for 1 year in 1980, And I thought, what on earth am I doing on this? There are lots of very good, competent activists. I should be using my time to do background research. And James uses this phrase, scholarship is our activism. And in a sense, if you look across this department, the staff are incredibly busy, much busier than the average academic, because many of them involved in all kinds of non-government organisations, but doing policy work for them, not on the streets campaigning, but doing the background work. And doing it alongside their conventional academic research, which is why they tend to be under a certain degree of strain. We took a decision very early on that the department as a department would never ever take a stand on any issue, because that was not our job. But staff and students were completely free to take their own positions, but not trying to represent the department. And we're basically an academic department, we hope, doing critical independence. BISA, British International Studies Association, we started to go to BISA conferences about 15 years ago and present papers. The wider international relations community in Britain is basically pretty conservative, pretty ivory towerish and not policy orientated. There are exceptions, there are many very good exceptions, who tend to be rather isolated.
They're usually individual.
They're usually individuals, and one of the nicest things that was ever said to me was by one such individual about 5 years ago, who said that for people like him, peace studies was a beacon in the 1980s because we withstood pressures to close us down, and we showed you could have a department which was taking a much more policy orientated view. Things have changed a little bit in Britain, but not very much. There are some other departments, some of the more conventional IR departments, that do more policy work. But essentially, it's not particularly strong, and I think we are rather different. But we saw BISA as a very important part of the national scene in Britain. And Owen Green, I think, was on the BISA exec for a while, and I spent the last 4 years as vice chair and chair. And I suppose, really, when I was asked if I would take that on, I mean, apart from the sort of, in a sense, the honour of doing it, it seemed to make sense to do because it helped establish that peace studies was part of this wider community. And I think we've become more active in it, and perhaps we should have done earlier.
Well, I mean,
but it was a question of time constraints.
Yeah.
We had BISA here in the year 2000. It was their 25th anniversary conference. It was the Millennium Conference. And that was hard work, but that was very worthwhile doing, actually. I think in many areas it does have a lot to be quite proud of. I mean, I think in the peace research area, some of the other developments got a better look in early on, like gender studies. I think trying to combine an appreciation of socioeconomic difference and environmental constraints has been a thread over really many years, which we haven't seen so much in other disciplinary areas. At the same time, peace research has been almost inevitably reactive to major events. So you had all the controversies in the 1970s over Vietnam. You had the, in my view, fully necessary response to the dangers of the Cold War in the 1980s. I think, if anything, although many departments and units were established in response to the dangers of the 1980s and may since have receded, what we see very strongly is an intense interest in peace and conflict issues in the global south. Quite extraordinary. You know, I mean, we get students from a huge range of countries. If you want to look at where much more work is being done on conflict resolution, on conflict management, you have to look to Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and there's an awful lot happening there. I think the redevelopment after 20 years of being defunct of the UN University for Peace in Costa Rica is a very interesting sign. I was there just last week. They now have the best part of 100 graduate students, and they're developing a whole series of programs that can be fed to other universities that may not have their own facilities. The interest is intense on global issues. And that is where I think maybe peace studies may be coming into its own now in a way which we hadn't predicted. And I think ever since 9/11 and the war on terror, you're starting to get very good groups, both academic and NGOs, who are saying we've got to take an alternative view. It's manifestly evident the war on terror is being counterproductive. It's not working as intended. It is failing. It may be very difficult to get an alternative view put forward in the current political climate, but it's going to have to be done. And I think this is an area of huge potential and promise now. I think the next 20 or 30 years are going to be dominated by two big issues. Socioeconomic divisions. 1.25 billion people are doing very well, most of the rest aren't. The division is widening steadily, and it's not generally recognised. The majority who are doing less well are far better educated and knowledgeable about their own marginalisation. That is a recipe for radical social movements. And in one small way, Al-Qaeda may be an early symptom of that. That's one thing. The second thing, inevitably, is environmental constraints. Location of almost, what, 2/3 of all the world's oil in one narrow area in the Persian Gulf, but even more important, climate change. You know, my wife and I have a small holding in the East Pennines in the north of England. I planted a vineyard 5 years ago. It's doing quite well. Couldn't have done that 25 years ago. But in the immediate future, what we have is a very early response to a danger, which I call a lidite response. Lidism is keeping the lid on things, not addressing the underlying problems. And the war on terror is a classic example of that, and it's going very badly wrong.